Back to our second session of the day. In this session, writers who work with supernatural and horror elements unravel the peculiar, dynamic, and essential characteristics of horror in Indian writing. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Rakesh Khanna is an author and co founder of BLAF Publications in Chennai, which publishes translations of Indian fiction, folklore, weird fiction, and graphic novels. Rakesh is the author of Ghosts, Monsters, and Demons of India and editor of BLAF's Tamil pulp fiction and forthcoming Gujarati pulp fiction anthologies. Sometimes he edits mathematics textbooks. He is interested in marine invertebrates, demonology, topological graph theory, and banging on things to see what they sound like. Jayaprakash Satyamurthy's writings cover a range of formats, including the self published short story collections Come Tomorrow and Shelter from the Storm, novella Strength of Water, and anthologies The Valenco Book of World Horror Volume 2, The Golan's Book of South Asian Fiction Volume 2. He is also a musician and is a part of the doom bands Jinn and Miskatonic and Ifrit. Khayal Patel, who is joining us online, is a best selling author. His book Tarikhshir, The Awakening, was consistently number one on the Amazon bestseller charts in Indian writing and fantasy. His second book, The Zamindar's Ghost, was a chart topper in horror and mystery. He has an unhealthy addiction to chocolate and, on occasion, eats cake for breakfast. Sometimes he wants to give up his writing career, train hard, and fight crime dressed like a flying rodent. Until that happens, he's going to keep writing books in various genres. Our moderator for this session is T.G. Shenoy. Shenoy is a reader, science fiction and fiction enthusiast, and a columnist whose writings have appeared in several publications, including Locus magazine. He's the writer of India's long-running weekly SF column, New Worlds Weekly for Factor Daily, and the SpecFix column in Bangalore Mirror. He is currently the creative director at Publicis Business Leo Burnett. Over to you, Shenoy.
Right, so welcome to the session on horror, where we're going to discuss horror writing, and by that I mean novels and short stories, not the kind you read in the newspapers every day. So just to make that clear, right? Horror is. How many of you read horror? Yeah, see, definitely. See, it's one of those love and fear comes together kind of genre. You want to watch the movie, but you don't want to watch it alone, right? You want to read the novel, but then you'll go sleep with the lights on that night, right? Despite that fear, and that's I think one of the things that makes horror what it is. This sort of paradoxical relationship that we have with it. Uh, Speaking for me personally, my first exposure to horror, I mean, I'm dating myself by saying that there was this old Doordarshan serial called Kile Ka Rahasya. Once upon a time in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. So in the midst of all the Nukkads and Ye Jo Hai Zindagis and Spider-Mans, there was this Kile Ka Rahasya which used to come at night, and it was quite scary. And that was the first time I was exposed to horror. And then as you grow up, the usual Edgar Allan Poe's and all of that happened. Tales of the supernatural and all that sort of this thing. And some didn't even have ghosts, right? Half the time the terror was implied, and everything played out in your mind, right? This is the only genre that can do that, right? It just lets your mind form things, right? And and no two people can read that same story the same way, right? Because no two people have the same fears and the same, sort of demons in your head, right? So, and then as you grew up, and then suddenly things like Ahat and Z Horror Show happened, and then you got exposed to the Ramsey style of filmmaking or Ramsey style of horror, right? And then until then, to be honest, I thought that horror is a visual medium. Because everything that I had tried, I mean, except for the Poe, everything that I did was seen on horror was on screen. And then when you started reading, right, it was like a window into another world, into, you know, sort of stepping over to the dark side, literally. And that, you know, how words could sort of play in your head. And we have with us people who've done that, right? So without me going on, first, Khayal, I'd like to ask them all of you first. What was your first exposure to horror, right? And what made you
Uh,
fall in love with it, and why do you love this genre, and that you decided to write horror novels?
I think it's a two-pronged approach. It was to add to your point. I grew up in the time where the horror show and Ahat had started gaining prominence, and it was. I think that was too too scary for me. It was when I was growing up. The theme still gives me PTSD. The Z horror show theme, which was I think beyond its time, but on the other end, there was also a very PG-13 Scooby Doo version of things where it was comedic horror. There wasn't really horror. There were monsters and there were ghosts and all of it, but it was very controlled. And when I started with Scooby Doo and then shifted to the Z horror show and horror as a more visual medium, it was always a sense of the unknown. I think as people, we're always wanting to discover or always wanting to understand the truth behind the myth. And I think one of the most wonderful things of being in a country like India is like every village, every city, every street has somebody who has a story which is either an urban legend or they know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who's met a ghost or seen a ghost or whatever variation of that you want to pick up. But I think it was always about exploring the supernatural and just when you really break it down, it is about us trying to find out what lies after death. And you could do it in a metaphysical way, like smart people do, or you could do it like I chose to do and just treat them as very very black and white creatures of the night. So that was one of the things, just beginning with what I grew up with that excited me. So that's when I decided to just go into that as a medium when I chose to write.
Okay, so okay, that's valid too. That's one way of getting into it. Rakesh, what about you?
So yeah, I mean, disclaimer: like, I'm not a writer of horror fiction. I've tried but failed. But I'm an editor and publisher, basically, and I wrote some nonfiction. But
And that's good nonfiction. I mean,
thanks. But and like, as far as like Indian horror, I came very late. Like, my mother is American and my father was Punjabi, but I was raised in California, and like, my father did not bring a whole lot of his culture to California. Like, I didn't grow up with Hindu stories.
don't worry, you're not
or
in a
anything like
minority.
that.
I know a lot of Indian readers
Yeah.
who also come to Indian horror quite late in their reading career.
So my mother is a horror fan, and like, and she likes, she liked Brothers Grimm folk horror, and she was a big Shirley Jackson fan. Like, The Old Haunting was her favorite movie, which I watched probably too young, and it used to freak me out. And but I think I got really interested in monsters around like 6th grade when I got into Dungeons and Dragons. There was a book, the 1977 Gary Gygax's Monster Manual, which, if anybody has played Dungeons and Dragons, it's like a catalog of these monsters which they've taken from folklore from all over the world. There's like the kappa from Japanese folklore and kobolds from German folklore, and they've given them hit points and armor class, and you can fight them in the game, right? And there were like 3 Indian monsters in that book. There was the Yeti, and there was the Naga, and there was one more I'm forgetting. But there was also a book called Deities and Demigods, which was like very problematic. I don't think it could be published today. But basically, they had made all the gods of like the Egyptian pantheon and the Norse pantheon, also playable characters in the game. And there was a section like Hindu mythos. And they had their, Indra has this many hit points, and this is his armor class, and Kali has this many hit points, and her alignment you must have seen these alignment charts, like lawful good, neutral good, chaotic good. So Kali's alignment was given as lawful evil. And my father had a big problem with this. My father had never talked to me about religion at all, but he was like, no, how can they say that Kali is evil? This is totally wrong. He got really mad at the game. And this is the first time that my father and I are having any discussion about religion. So anyway, from that time I was interested in what is evil and what are Indian monsters and what are Indian demons and what is this whole thing with black magic. When we did visit India, you find that like here most people kind of do magic a little bit, right? It's you hang the chili and lime from your door, or you put the spot on the baby's cheek or whatever. It's like it's alive, like normal sane people do this, right? Whereas I think in the West, it's not that people aren't superstitious, but that superstition comes from like another plane. It's like divine intervention or satanic intervention. But in India, it's like it's in our plane, right? It's like these things are happening around us. So, and then when we started publishing it, we were doing translations of pulp fiction. Many of those stories are horror or horror elements, and we were doing a lot of folklore. I'm very interested. I mean, the interest in monsters led to an interest in folklore. We published a book of Tamil folk tales. We published a book of folk tales from Mizoram. The Northeast has like these amazing monster stories and wonderful horror folk tales. So that's where it came from.
Jaiprakash, what about you? I mean, given the fact that you were the one who sort of introduced me to Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith.
So I just wanted to mention that a name I had suggested for this session was Our Song, Our Kali. And what he said reminded me of that, because when it comes to horror in India, one of the first things anyone who reads Western science fiction, fantasy, and horror will encounter is this award-winning novel called The Song of Kali by Dan Simmons, which is a dreadful travesty of a book about the bitch goddess Kali and the horrible people of India and the inhumanity of Calcutta, which is quite accurate as far as it goes, but it's this despicable novel in which the only nice Indian character is a woman who's safely married to a white guy. And there's a terrible character in it called Jaiprakash. Yes, Jaiprakash. Yeah. So I was thinking a very interesting title for a session like this would also be Our Songs, Our Kalis, because we're all Indian or fundamentally or half Indian in origin, and each of us are talking about how we relate to horror in the Indian context. For me, the very first thing that scared me was folk art depictions of Krishna with fish eyes. And those really creeped me out. I was 6 or 7 or less. And in the night, I started having dreams of those fish eyes floating outside my bedroom window, which backed onto a church compound, and there were huge tamarind trees. So that's really where fear entered my life. And then soon afterwards, I had a volume of Edgar Allan Poe. And The Fall of the House of Usher was one of the stories that really captured me. And yeah, my father was a bit of a horror hound. So through my father's and grandfather's libraries, I've read authors like Algun and Blackwood. In the 80s, my father became a Stephen King fan like everybody. But he also had lots of earlier collections from the 70s and 60s of the Pan Books of Horror, which was this long-running series from the United Kingdom, which started very classy, and then as the 60s and 70s progressed, became more and more trashy and lurid horror. So it was a great introduction to the whole range. And then because in Indian schools, at least in my time, our education in English was very rooted in the Edwardian and Victorian era, I would read things like The Signal Man by Charles Dickens, and so Victorian ghost stories, which are an amazing tradition, which I like to think I in some ways still add to, but in a modern Bangalorean sense, were something that really captured me very early on. Cinematic horror was something that didn't play a big part in my equation, and yeah, it's still secondary for me. I'm very interested in how religion and fear intersect because of the eyes of Krishna freaking me out as a child. And religion in India is very interesting because you can go to a dance drama, like one that I went to in Kodaikanal, attached to the Kurinji Andavar temple. And this man actually has the god within him. You know, the one in the long red robe. He's got the Kurinji Andavar within him, and it's frightening. It's frightening to look at him. This particular guy collapsed at the end of his dance, and I was like, is he okay? And then 15 minutes later, I saw him sort of stood up, and he still had the God in him. I'm not a believer, but there was something in him that night. Yeah. So I think this sense of the veil being thin felt very real and still feels very real.
Yeah, I mean, Indian horror, if you look at it, is so intertwined with our folklore and our religion, so much so that it feels like, you know, they're so part of our culture that they live with us and we live with them, right? It's not theoretical. It's not sort of disconnected. I mean, if you look at sort of Western creatures like your vampires and succubi and all of that, right? They're still sort of theoretical, if I may use that word. Whereas here, it's part of the living culture, right? And we have so many of them. We have so many of them. There was this graphic novel called These Savage Shores by Ram V. If you can get hold of it, please read it. It's nice. So basically, it's set during the early days of when India was getting colonized, and then there's this British ship which is sailing, and supernatural creature, I won't spoil it for you, boards the ship thinking that, okay, it's going to India, virgin territory, I'll be the top dog there, like I'm supernatural, I'm the demon, I'm the monster, India is my virgin territory, and then he lands up here and he finds out that, India has, it lands up in Kerala and finds out that there are more monsters and supernatural creatures than he can handle, right? Because Kerala, what was it called again? It is called These Savage Shores by Ram V. Right? And so, I'd like to go back to you guys again to get your opinions and thoughts on what makes Indian horror different. Of course, apart from the fact that it's, like for example, in your book, one of the supernatural this thing you mentioned is Panjurli. Right? And okay, thanks to Kantara, everyone knows Panjurli. Right? But it's not theoretical. Right? For example, my family's Daiva is Baikarti Panjurli. Right? And we worship Panjurli. We do Bhuta Kola, and yeah, there is sacrifices given and all of those things. But to a Western mind or to a very urbanized mind, it would look like it's horror, it's scary, it's frightening. But we don't look at it like that. Or like Jayaprakash mentioned Kali, right? If you look at some of the Western metal bands and stuff like that, right? Kali is, their version of, I don't know, Satan or something like that, right? Sometimes they use it as a... There's been a lot of improvement, but they look at Kali as just demonic, this thing. Yes, yeah, right? Yeah, of course, she's got blood-stained, scimitars, her tongue is out, dripping with blood. She's got a garland of skulls, right? I mean, this is a classic horror, right? But, it's a goddess we worship. It's a goddess we turn to, make supplications and all of that, right? So, your thoughts on that? I mean, you've done so much research and you've read D&D and been exposed to Western horror. What are those fundamental differences, and what's,
I mean, it's so hard to generalize about this country, right? Like every part of it is so different. So, both in folklore and in fiction, I think there's like really different scenes. And so we've been working. So we've published translations from like Tamil and from Urdu and from a couple of northeastern languages now. And it's like it's all very different. Right? Like we've been working. We might trying to publish some translations of a Marathi horror writer, Ratnakar Matkari. So that is very, it's like psychological, but it's psychological horror, but it's also, I think, it reminds me a little bit of like Tales of the Crypt, what used to come in 1950s. It's very cynical about human nature. And
I read the book Darkness, the Vikram Pandey translation.
Okay.
It's one Indian horror book that I would recommend to this thing. It's by Ratnakar Matkar. It's called Darkness, and it's translated by Vikram Pandey.
But I find that like a very different style than anything I've seen in Tamil. Like in Tamil, especially in Tamil pulp, you have these kind of jump scare novels, and maybe this is like the PG-13 stuff, the Scooby-Doo, more like the Scooby-Doo kind of thing. Like it's a series of, what's behind that door? Oh, I'm opening the door and there's a severed head, and now it's like I'm running away from that, and I see something else which is scary, and it's like, it's more about the images and scary images than it is about any sort of coherent plot. But those were really popular. Like those books sold a lot in Tamil.
Pulp fiction.
Yeah, and then like the Northeast has its own like really deep, really crazy legends. And I feel like a lot of the Northeastern languages have a thing which reminds me of the Japanese yokai. Like there's so many different demons, each one has a name, each one has different attributes. They'll come at different times. They'll trouble you in these different ways. This one has its 3 eyes stacked vertically. This one has 4 tails. This one, each one has a slightly different description, and there's many. So, and I don't find that in other parts of India. Like in Gujarat, it's Kavis and Dakkan, and that's it. So, I don't know. It's very hard to generalize.
Gujarat doesn't have monsters?
They have, but there's 2. Like if you ask them what are the indigenous Gujarati ghosts, there's 2 words. Whereas if you go to Kuki tribe in Manipur and ask them the name of your ghost, they'll be 300.
Yeah, just
it's a long list.
Or if you just go to Kerala, I mean, there's... Oh.
Yeah, okay, so I talk about necrodiversity hotspots, right?
Huh?
Necrodiversity hotspots. Like the Western Ghats have, and the Northeast. And even Kumaon is also another place. Kumaon has an insane diversity of ghosts.
Jayaprakash, what about you? Since you've read a lot of Western horror and you're a fan of Indian horror, what are those traits that stand out?
I'm not really familiar. I am audible? Yeah. I'm not really familiar with Indian horror as a genre. I've read a few stories, Rabindranath Tagore's The Hungry Stones, then The Yakshini by M.T. Vasudevan Nair. So these are literary authors who've turned to the eerie and the unnatural and the supernatural at one time or the other. I mentioned Yakshini by M.T. Vasudevan Nair from Kerala, The Hungry Stones by Rabindranath Tagore. Sort of coming a little more contemporary, there was a Marathi writer called Vilas Sarang, whose first collection, Fair Tree of the Void, was very fascinating. There's one particular short story in it where he talks about the Ganesha pandals are all over Bombay, and all the mushikas have disappeared. And people are very worried. What does this mean? Is this inauspicious? Are we cursed? At the same time, there are rats in his building. And for some reason, through all this, the narrator, who runs a photography studio, is being hounded by a customer who needs his passport photos delivered quickly because he's a blind man who's been invited to a conference in the USA. The very end of the story has a scene where our narrator is at the beach and he watches all the Ganeshas walk off into the ocean. It's a very, very mysterious, and when you read it, a very dark and scary and yet whimsical story. And for me, that kind of sums up what could distinguish Indian horror, that everything is weirdly multivalent. The deity could also be frightening. The frightening could also be familiar and comforting, because Ganesha is a person of good omen, opener of ways. But him or his representatives walking out into the ocean means he's abandoning Mumbai symbolically. And at the same time, sacred yet mundane, because the mushikas that come away from the pandals wind up being the rats in the man's basement. Another writer I want to quickly mention, or perhaps he's more appropriate for the next section, is Nair Masood, who does the same thing for the city of Lucknow. So I think a lot of what could set Indian horror about, and I think everything we've said sort of touches on that, is the way what everyone's already mentioned is the way things are so patterned into everyday life, but also the ambiguity of auspicious versus inauspicious, of sacred versus infernal, of mundane and celestial. And I think these are explorations that come very naturally in whatever I've read of imaginative fiction in general in India. Also things like O.V. Vijayan, who didn't write horror, but who kind of brought magical realism into the Malayalam novel. So I think there's this sort of sense of quantum entanglement with multiple moral spectra and realities.
Yeah, and probably we're the only culture where mothers and grandmothers scare their children by, right at the, probably that was my first exposure to horror and monsters. Like, Malko illandre gumma bartane. I mean, I don't think anyone in the West says, go to sleep or, I'll sick a vampire on you. Right? And
I think the Germans are like that.
Huh?
I think the Germans are like that.
okay, the Germans are weird in more ways than one. Kayal, what about you? What are your thoughts on this?
I think absolutely. It's just the mysticism is so rooted in our everyday lives. To add to what you said about the savage shores, it's just there's a beauty in it. There's a beauty in just knowing that every day in an average Indian household or in India in general, there is a sense of mysticism which the West always looks at. Whether they don't obviously depict it accurately. You take Indiana Jones or you take even the Savage Shores to a certain extent, but there is a consistent mystery, I think, which is associated with us, which sets us apart. I think when you look at Western monsters or you look at Western just the culture, the monotheism of there's a god and there's a devil and demons, it's just very black and white. But for us, I think every city or every area, like Rakesh says, there are going to be villages which are going to have their own ghost stories, and those ghost stories are very, very close by. They're just going to be a ghost who resides in a banyan tree as opposed to a vampire in a castle, which really makes the fear very close to home. And I think that's what differentiates us from the entirety of maybe what the West looks at monsters and ghosts.
And since you mentioned city and Jayaprakash, since you mentioned Lucknow, wanted to take this thing into the city as a character, right? I mean, recently, about a few months ago, I read this book by Chandrima Das. It's called Young Blood. Basically, it's a collection of short stories, basically based on sort of campus stories, campus legends, right? So one is set in Pune, one is set in KMC in Manipal, and because I'm close to Manipal and I've heard about that horror legend and stuff, it couldn't have been set anywhere else, right? There are some things that have to be set in that city, like for example, Jayaprakash, your Come Tomorrow. I mean, it couldn't be set anywhere but in Bangalore. Bangalore is, a character in the background.
There is that Hindi movie that sort of...
Stree.
Yeah.
I mean, all of you know about the Come Tomorrow Ghost,
Even
right?
that one was Telugu first, I think, right?
It's called the Naleba Ghost. I mean, just a brief recap for those who don't know. This was in the 90s. There was this ghost which was supposed to come to your house. I mean, resident of Bangalore, true blue Bangalorean. So it will come to your house and in the voice of your kin or something, it will knock on the door. And if you open the door, that's it, you're done for. Right? The only way to escape certain death, because she'll visit everyone, it's a Shiva, she'll visit every house, is to write Nale Ba on your door, which is come tomorrow. So it's a very literate ghost, right? So she'll come, she'll see Nale Ba, she'll go, and she'll come back again tomorrow. And then she'll see Nale Ba. And the best part was, in areas like Vivek Nagar and Austin Town and all, the doors, they're like, Nalike va. Right? Some places in Shivaji Nagar and Tilak Nagar are like Kalau, and a very multilingual ghost. Right? So, I mean, that story of yours could have been set only in Bangalore because it's a prominent background character, even though it doesn't have any speaking parts. So, I'd like to your thoughts, Jayaprakash, on the city as a character in horror. Right? I mean, you did mention Mathur and Lucknow.
So I briefly mentioned Nair Masood, the wonderful Urdu writer from Lucknow, who I think has written some of the most effective uncanny stories ever to come out of India. You may not classify them purely as horror, they're very hard to pin down, but they're very much set in the mouldering Havelis. They sometimes fixate on architectural details like the old rusty weathercock, which seems to be moving in the direction of a wind that no one else can see or feel. There is one story which is named after a particular pillar which you have at the threshold. I forget the Urdu word. And just like, Bruno Schulz's Street of Crocodiles could only be in the city where he grew up with the spices and the particular culture and the mad father, I think Nair Masood's stories are so Lucknowi. And similarly, Vilas Sarang's story that I was talking about is so Mumbai. The beach, the pandals. Of course, we have these pandals in many Indian cities, but in the particular way he talks about them. So India is a country of megapolises. The city we are currently sitting within has a larger population than several Eastern European countries or Central American states, right? And India is a site of vast urbanization. Just Shenoy and I have seen since the 90s our city kind of spiraling into this massively dense, but also much huger landscape. Some of the places some people live in were villages even in the 80s. Like there is a part of Kormangla, which is very much urban Bangalore, which even in the 80s when my friend's mother was growing up there was like a village with woods around it. And there are still traces of those woods.
I stay in a place called Devachikkanhalli, which is off Banegata Road, right? And I'm told, I mean, been living there for 10 years, but till about 15, 18 years, people would still say, it seems, nan Bangalore hog bartini.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes still joke to my friends in such far-off places as Jayanagar, JP Nagar, when are you coming down to Bangalore to meet me?
And the beauty of this, okay, so I live in Devachikkanhalli, so there's Devachikkanhalli, next is Kodichikkanhalli, right? Then there is Bilekhalli, right? Then there's Nanappanhalli. Yeah. And the thing is, each of these have their own, what you call, Grama Devatas.
Yeah.
Right? And they're all Devis and all that, and, still, those little lemons and everything happens. It still happens. I mean, you mentioned urbanization, right? These are, you could make a horror story of any of these, and it's still happening today.
There's a place in Betahalasuru near the airport where there are footprints in the rock near the local temple, which is, according to them, another place where Hanuman landed. It's not just a half dozen or less famous places where Hanuman supposedly touched down. You'll find little things like this everywhere. Something else I wanted to mention, which you reminded me of, Beta Halusuru, Rock Halusuru. Yeah, so it's fascinating how many of the places that we're walking through were villages, were small towns, were agricultural lands. A lot of the places where IT people have offices on the way to the old airport, which is no longer an airport, were rice paddies even in the 90s. And, traveling tent theaters would come there. So I think what I really wanted to get at is that cities are a huge feature of our landscape. And cities kind of become a pressure cooker of people from different geographies, different economic backgrounds, different cultures. So all our cities are not just well-settled, more or less homogeneous cities that have existed like this for 400 years or 500 years or more, but they're big churning places.
And they still come tomorrow happens.
Yeah, it still happens. It happened when I was in college, when I was in second PUC. In the neighborhood I was living in Wilson Garden, the chalk words started appearing on the doors. So I think there's a huge reckoning with the city as a creature. I did once write a story about a young boy from a village running to Bangalore to pick up a job. And the city almost becomes like this squat monster on the horizon, that's sucking up the life of everything around it. But on the other hand, it's also where people get life from. So it's very confusing. Cities as a character are not limited to horror, but they do tend to evoke the uncanny. Like, London authors like Peter Ackroyd, Ian Sinclair, Alan Moore, they always seem to. What happens is the city has so many layers in it. There's still a place in Bangalore, in Shivajinagar, where you'll see the Black Pilly plaque. And Black Pilly was where they had a plague hospital in the outbreak of plague in the 19th century.
And then we also had, I think, a god is a Plagamma or
who is
Plagamma,
connected
right?
in some ways with the Naleba ghost, because this instance of Naleba in the 90s happened because there were some cases of plague in Surat, in the north. And we thought that, this is the way you prevent the plague mother from visiting you. But at the same time, the plague mother is also the Amal, the one that you pray to remove the plague.
Yeah, Plagamma, right.
Yeah.
The name itself
Her
is
temples are there in Shivajinagar.
Yeah. Rakesh, what about you? What are your thoughts on the city as a character in horror and how, the setting helps with the story?
Yeah, so a lot of the folkloric ghosts a lot of the interviews I did and stuff I was reading for this book, a lot of people talked about how the ghosts don't come anymore. Now that there's electricity, they don't come. They don't like, wired villages. They won't come when there's electric light. But then there's also sort of this new breed of ghosts that interact with electricity and technology and stuff. And interestingly, there's the Ifrit, which is one variety of jinn, which you find people talk about Ifrit being like tech savvy. There's they're writing viruses, and there's one big theory about how the Conficker worm, which took down a bunch of software in 2018, was created by jinn, by Ifrit. So you get there's some ghosts which do interact. There's Monkey Man in Delhi, who's got he shows up with flashy. Yeah, he's got his helmet and roller skates, but he's also got electric lights, right? Or the Munochwa, which was that face scratcher urban legend that was in I think Lucknow, but smaller towns around Lucknow. Yeah. And people were not sure if it's an insect or if it's a robot or if it's some genetically modified half robot, half insect, which the Pakistani military has developed. And there are a lot of stories. But it had electric lights and it'll come and scratch people's face in the night. And there's the Huddle, which is a Marathi ghost who's supposed to be able to broadcast. The voice will come over your sound system, or Stranger Things type, it'll start affecting all the electricity in the house.
So even the ghosts and the monsters are keeping up with the times.
Yeah, so that's an interesting breed to me. So on the one hand, there's some ghosts which have fallen away; they don't come anymore because of technology and electricity. But some have adopted.
Kayal, what are your thoughts on this, of the city as a character and how it plays out in your horror and the horror that you read?
I think most of the horror which I read when I was growing up, it always, whether you look at Edgar Allan Poe, you look at Ruskin Bond, everybody brought the city in because every city has a sense of eeriness or a darker corner to it. Victorian England, for the largest part, had the most amount of ghosts or eeriness associated. Any kind of Victorian England literature that you read, whether it was ghosts or whether it was Jack the Ripper or something of that sort, which was very real. Every city has, I think, that one sense of character. A city is a character in every novel, because whenever you say cities also, you look at Bangalore, or you look at Lucknow, or you look at Calcutta or Mumbai or Surat or anywhere. Every city, I think, to each of us has a very distinct interpretation. Nobody will ever confuse a Surat with a Bangalore. And to your point, some ghosts just work in some cities where the folklore is very rooted. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. You couldn't pick this three ghosts and put them in a in a larger cosmopolitan city. You had to pick a certain area, a certain village, or a certain part of a city for it to actually work.
The ghosts and monsters seem to have like very well delineated jurisdictions. Huh? Yeah, I mean, it's full of that. I mean, they have sort of jurisdictions. Their curses will only work in that, this one. Right? Okay, we're doing sort of okay on time. So, what I would like to ask you guys is, apart from the ones that you've written, what are some of the Indian horror books that you liked, why you liked it, and what you would recommend to someone who wants to explore Indian horror?
So I've already named some of the things I'd suggest. I'll just repeat them. Any collection of short stories by Nair Masood, Naiyer Masud. They're just brilliant. Vilas Sarang, Vilassarang. The thing is that he published a later short story collection where he revised a lot of the short stories in the first Penguin India collection of his. So I would say dig through the second-hand bookstores and look for Fair Tree of the Void by Vilas Sarang. These are stories in Marathi translated by the author himself, who was a literature teacher in Bombay. Try and find the earlier edition. I don't like the revisions, and his novel Tandoori Cinders was okay.
Okay.
But Fair Tree of the Void is brilliant. You should definitely look out for these particular stories of M.T. Vasudevan Nair and Rabindranath Tagore, which are probably in any good anthology of Indian literature. Oh, I'm forgetting a contemporary author of mine. So the Goan author Venita Coelho, who normally writes for children but also for grown-ups, has an amazing book of what she calls Oriental Gothic, called Whisper on the Wind, which is a very, very lovely Gothic novel set in Goa in the 60s, before Goan independence. A young Parsi from Bombay goes down to his ancestral home in Goa to sit and write a novel once and for all before his parents force him into the family business. And he starts talking to this little girl from the local orphanage, this little child, really. And yeah, Whisper on the Wind by Venita Coelho. Andali Bajid has quite an interesting haunted house novel set in Bangalore.
It's a very Bangalore. I mean, that's
so Bangalore.
It's so Andali Bajid's book that he's referring to, House of Screams, right?
House of Screams.
House of Screams. Again, that's a very, very Bangalore novel.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
I was jealous, actually.
Yeah. Try to do better.
Yeah,
we need more Bangalore horror.
Andali Bajid. Then there was a publishing house in Bangalore called Dronequill, Dronequil, who had a collection by a lady whose name I forget, many of which were ghostly stories and were set around shops in Chickpet or a piano teacher in Richmond Town and things like that. Dronequill, you'll have to look that up and do some sleuthing on your own. I've mentioned Masood, Sarang, Vajid, Venita Coelho. Of course, on a general level, imaginative literature in India, you could do worse than reading O.V. Vijayan, Legends of Kasakinte Itihasa. I wonder, I'm taking over now, if you have any further recommendations for us from the Indian languages that you read. Both, I know you read Kannada fluently, but you also read Hindi a lot better than I do.
We'll get to that. Let's finish
fine, yeah.
the panelists first. Your recommendations?
So yeah, there was an interview with like the actor Matt Damon, I think one time, where they were asking him about Godfather, and he says, "I've not seen The Godfather." I think it was some famous movie like that. And he said, "I'm too busy making movies. I don't get to watch them." So I feel a little bit like that. Like most of the stuff I've been reading is stuff that we're publishing or editing. And actually there's a lot of books, big list of books that I want to read that I've not got to yet. So, but I can recommend stuff that we've published.
So, yeah, no, because one of the books that you published is in my recommended list. It's by P.S. Nissim. It's called Brown Boy.
Yeah,
I mean, how did that come to be? Because that's one of, I mean, it's a very thin book. I think
It's a novella,
available
yeah,
outside. It's a
yeah.
novella, right? You can finish it in one reading, but this the eeriness of it, the hint of the supernatural, the anticipation. I mean,
Yeah, it's a fun one. It's set in like the Sikkim foothills, and it's about a small child snatch demon. So that's a nice story.
yeah, that's definitely one that I would recommend. Brown Boy.
And then we published several books by Kurli Monica, who is not always horror, but sometimes she goes there. And it's like a little bit cracked psychological horror, I
See,
think.
but just because see the boundaries of horror are not like sort
Yeah.
of cast in stone. It sort of tends to bleed into sort of other genres, and you necessarily don't need to have reincarnated. I mean, one ghost or one chudel. I mean, though it helps.
Yeah. And then in researching this, I read a lot of really old books, which were lots of fun. Like there's a book called Assamese Demonology from like 1895, which is really fun. And
That would be non-fiction, I presume.
Rajkoa. Yeah, well, it's like a collection of folklore
Okay.
from 130 years ago, which is brilliant. And then, Assamese Demonology, or even like Khasi folklore, close to my heart. I love from Meghalaya, like Khasi folklore is scary a lot of the time. There's this serpent demon called Tlain who demands human sacrifice, and that story is retold in many versions, including modern versions. And I love Tlain stories; they're great.
Kayal, any recommendations from you on
I
in
think-
Indian horror? Apart from the
I think
Zamindar's
I'm-
Ghost, of course.
No,
That's
I
on the list
think,
for sure.
Thank you. No, but I think I'm going to go with Rakesh's answer on this one. The only ones I was really exposed to was Ruskin Bond. I didn't know he wrote a lot of horror, and he wrote a lot of good horror. So that is something I definitely recommend. And full disclosure, I even have Rakesh's book, because a lot of stuff I write is genre mashups. So it's really kind of looking at folklores or stories or about ghosts that I haven't read. So I think that's also a wonderful collection. I'm still going through it to kind of just see how I could add a ghost into the next thing I'm writing. But I think my experience with that is with Indian authors very, very limited to just Ruskin Bond now.
Okay.
There's also a werewolf novel by Indra Sinha, whose name I'm forgetting. You know Indra Pramit Sinha, right?
Indra Pramit Das.
Sorry, I mix up all these names.
Yeah,
Indra Das
the
was a
Devour-
werewolf novel.
The Devourers.
The one in
Devourers.
the Mughal era.
Yeah,
think.
the Devourers.
That's also...
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mixed up everything, but I liked that. Yes.
Yeah, it's Indra Das, the Devourers. So when he said Indra, I was like, okay, little thrown apart. Right, so I mean, we've listed out
His
a lot.
new one
right?
is good also,
Already
the
mentioned
Last Dragoners.
Ratnakar Matkari's Darkness. Another one that I would recommend is Jessica Fellero's. It's called Afterlife. It's called Ghost Stories from Goa. It's a collection of short stories and lots. I mean, there's a haunted library in it, right? Then there's the other way where a dead uncle is trying to contact the living from the grave, right? So a lot of things happen there, and yeah, we've mentioned a lot enough. And over the course, I've said Savage Shores and Chandrima Das's Young Blood. So yeah, so there's a lot of Indian horror out there. And when you said you came late to Indian horror, like I told you, you're not alone. Lots of horror fans that I read. I mean, I don't know if it's like a case of, own house like chicken, own house like lentil, gar ki murgi dal barabar types, right? But there's a lot to explore in Indian horror, and there's also the book called Maya's New Husband by Neil De Silva. Neil De Silva writes a lot of horror. Hari Kumar writes a lot of horror. So it would be good if we had more Indian readers support Indian writers, especially in horror, because usually you'd think, like I said, that we think of horror as being a visual medium, and it doesn't translate, especially our kind of stories don't translate well into the written medium. But if you read these books, you'll know that they do, right? And then whether you choose to sleep with the lights on or off is up to you. Thank you all for being a good audience. Thank you, Jay Prakash, Rakesh, and Kayal for all your thoughts and Right? Thank you all, and thank you to IHS and Shani for organizing and putting up with all the delays and everything. Thank you. And the safest way, perhaps, to experience fear without losing anything, right? There are experiences. I mean, we've always been fascinated with death, right? And what happens after death. That's why your ghosts come in. You would like to know, right? And we've always had a fear of the dark, fear of the unknown. Then there's the supernatural creatures, right? So it's curiosity, and like I said right at the beginning, it's a sort of love fear relationship. I want to feel fear. I want to feel that sense of impending doom. But while one part of me is saying nothing will happen, right? Nothing will happen, I'm good, it's just stories on the page. The other part of me, like I said, wants to sleep with the lights on, right? It's that feeling. I mean, Jaiprakash, Rakesh, Kayal, do you have anything
I would
to
also
say?
say that horror isn't separate from anything else. I was reading a few days ago, A.K. Ramanujan's translations of Namalvar, the medieval Tamil poet who wrote about Vishnu. And, there are some passages where he talks about, "In my evil heart you live, Lord." And why would an evil person still have devotion? And then there are other poems where the sense of being possessed by the divinity is, it's almost as frightening as the typical Catholic haunting that we see in Hollywood movies. I don't think horror is separate from anything else. And I think some of our imaginations just explore everything else through that lens, and some don't. So it's not separate from other things, and it's a lens. It's a lens some of us use, some don't.
I sort of came up with my own theory while I was researching this that like it's not too many generations back that human beings had predators, right? Like there used to be cave bears and there used to be saber-toothed tigers and much larger animals that could kill you and were, out at night and you had to be careful about them. And I think we've probably evolved to deal with that in some way. Like, we should know about them. We should know what are their habits and, how to avoid them, how to trick them. Maybe there's like a space in our brains that,
Surplus.
yeah, we don't have anything to fill that anymore, so we have to make up stories.
That's a huge part of why we tell stories, right?
Yeah.
There are all these structures left in our brains that are just doing things.
Kayal, why horror?
I think it's because one, we're always fascinated. We're always fascinated by the unknown, be it good or bad. I think it's a very natural human instinct to open every door, press every button, just to see what it does. And I think we're wired that way, to always keep exploring, and at the same time there is that fear of the unknown, which is also wired into us. To add to what Rakesh said, through generations it's been genetically coded into us to have that primal fear of the unknown, and that's exciting and it's scary at the same time.
Yeah. So just two things I would add is good horror at the end of the day plays on your fears, right? Plays on your fears and your, on your mind, right? So which is why, a good story, two people reading it, the experience is completely different because each person's fears, and demons in the head and everything is completely different. The other thing is when we are talking about horror in India and what makes for it, if you look around from that perspective of culture and stuff like that, what you would theoretically consider horror, the ingredients for a good horror story are around you, right? Whether it is Kali or whether it is folklore or whatever, the ingredients are around us. So you really can't escape horror in that sense if you are in India. Thank you.